Of course. Let's see. Ricardo.
This is not a man, this is a computer.
And your
My
name?
name is Elke. Elke.
Yes, oh yes.
Oh, you know? Oh, yes, you have been to Berlin.
Well, many times.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Berlin 4 or 5 times?
Okay.
Okay. 4 or 5 times to Hamburg, and it's to
You're from the
and a lot of the other guys there too. I spoke with a lot of people. So, yeah. All right. Good morning, buongiorno. I'm here to talk about something that in many ways is almost a taboo topic, not only in role-playing but in certain aspects of the larger culture. But the reason I want to bring it up is that it ties into my former point in my talk yesterday about honesty. And a lot of the games that are being played here this weekend focus on genuine interaction among human beings who are playing, and they also focus on topics in many cases, whether fantastic or not fantastic. They focus on topics which themselves are engaging emotionally. So it's, I think, notable that we're doing so in one of the locations in the world which has extremely consequential history in these terms. And most people I know think of Italy as Catholic, and more Catholic. But the fact is we are sitting in one of the great melting pots and points, if not literal origin, at least of serious interaction of many different kinds of Christianity, Judaism, and then ultimately, several centuries later, Islam. So this is not a trivial spot to sit in. There's a room here in this fortress that's dedicated to all 3 Abrahamic religions, and acknowledges the diversity of this spot. Well, to talk about religion, I have discovered that it is very important to distinguish among 4 different concepts. And they are personal belief, the metaphysical views and points of view that one might have. They are observance and practice, what you and perhaps others do visibly and socially. Then there are institutions in society, which are a very different variable, I think. And then finally, there is a generalized idea that over time in an area, that the language of values, the language of ethics, the language of politics has absorbed the religious terminology and has interacted with the religion for so long that it could properly be said to be part of, to have that kind of character. So these 4 concepts are not synonyms, and they don't even contain one another. Does anyone want to translate so far? Basics. Would anyone like to help me with getting some of these ideas into Italian, please?
pensiero, le cui convinzioni
una come istituzione.
Poi, la seconda, come pratiche esteriori.
Io ho preso queste, pratiche esteriori.
Right. So, belief, observance, church, effectively, and then finally culture. In Christianity, in English, we have pretty good terminology for that. For example, we say Christendom, or lately the West, to mean cultures which have been effectively primarily Christian, and that has started to characterize many aspects of the society. But in that term, I know Christendom is an older term, but if we imagine that anyway, inside you are going to find many different churches. So you don't have to be in big Christian culture to have a Christian church. And inside, and also people will observe a given religion that does not, or observes certain practices that are not part of a church. And also you can be in a particular institution or in a particular society and not share those particular beliefs. So none of these things really cause the others. We like to pretend they do. We like to pretend that if you believe, then you practice these practices, and then if you practice these practices, you do so in a church. We believe, we like to pretend that, but it's not true at all. So when I say religion, we have to focus on exactly which thing we mean, because they're extremely different variables. I find that when you want to criticize someone else's religion, you pick a level that's easily criticized, and then when you defend your own religion, you pick a different level entirely. That's something that people do a lot. So the fact that these are not, they're not a causal single chunk is important. In fact, people in, for example, Christian culture may consider themselves completely non-religious and will not be part of any church, and they don't carry out any practices or whatever, they don't believe anything, but their values are still very, very consistent with the generalized historical religious outlooks. There are some very good examples from American history. But anyway, so just to get some vocabulary down so that I can identify exactly what I mean when we talk about religion and role-playing as content. I also probably should tell you, to be absolutely clear, to tell you exactly where I am coming from with this personally. I am not a religious person. I don't have any real interest in knowing the cosmos or really feeling like I'm connected to the larger sphere of existence. It doesn't interest me very much. I did not rebel against that kind of training because I didn't get it. And I also am not looking for something kind of answer. I don't feel empty or, cut loose when I'm looking around for something to save me or explain things to me or anything like that. So it might seem strange that I'm absolutely fascinated with religion and want to talk for hours, about this. But the fact is, when I look at the texts of the different religions, and the ones that I know, I think, pretty well at this time, or a lot of the texts, are the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But I have contact with a number of others as well, Hindu and Buddhist and various other Asian religions, as well as some Native American stuff. And the point I would like to say is that people have used these texts, particularly people who wrote them, have used these texts as a way to discuss very difficult human issues. Family versus community. Community versus loyalty to an authority. Your ethics versus your family. questions that are raised and to focus on the three religions that I mentioned before. All of these are raised and then elaborated upon text after text. And you can see that within the individual books, and you can see that in the larger scale changes and regional modifications of the religions. So in other words, I think they're about something important. And that's not because I think God is important or anything like that. It's because I think a person might or might not. I don't think it's very relevant. I think in that sense, I think what is much more relevant is that if we pretend to be clear intellectuals who have grown past religion, this whole kind of mythology that we are so enlightened and so intellectual and so scientific and so modern, that we say, oh, we will just sweep all that superstition off the table. You just abandoned the primary literature of human reflection about everything that matters to us day to day. So I'm not interested in the books as instruction. I think when there's a whole section of instruction, it tells us a lot about the priests at that time. But I'll also point out that much of the books are used as instruction. Religious texts are often used as instruction, but if you actually go and read the text, it's not instructive. It wasn't written as an instruction. When somebody writes a historical account of somebody doing something to someone else and then this happens, and then somebody who wears a hat tells you, oh, this means that you have to do this or that. There's no logic there at all. So what I'm driving at is that the texts don't have to be interpreted by us the way that they are utilized institutionally. So I just want to let you know that that's my reading of these things, and that's why I think that their content is relevant. Partly because you don't have to read them metaphysically, but also because we live in a society that has been affected very strongly. All of us, anybody, anywhere. The society has this history of religious instruction and content. And you can call yourself an atheist and call yourself free of religion or anything you want to, but the fact is your values are probably very deeply shaped by these things in one fashion or another. So, so I guess that's one thing. Aspects, all four of these aspects in different ways factor into our personal identities. And I don't think there's an escape from that. I don't think that you can simply say, oh, religion is just gone. I just told you I didn't have specific religious instruction. The only church that I participated in as a child was the American West's Unitarian Church, which is best explained as a bunch of radicals pretending they're in a church. And that was not for very long. And as I say, I don't have any deep internal need for the metaphysical content. But it is outstandingly obvious that if you look at my values and my life, that it is from a person who came from a Christian culture as mediated through the local American environment. I mean, it's the person who would meet me or talk to me in my life would instantly, say, okay, I might say, oh, I'm not a Christian, and they just laugh at me. Of course, I'm from this culture, so it doesn't matter what's going on in my head or what church I belong to or something like that. So, but they are not really talking about belief. They are talking about certain frameworks of values, certain frameworks of approaching society. So, I mentioned politics as part of that, and it is, of course, because historically speaking, when you want to distinguish yourself from another group or rebel against an authoritarian group, or as an authoritarian group, create more education that suits your needs, you're almost certainly going to do it in religious terms for that culture. And we call ourselves in the States a secular culture, which is absolutely ridiculous, because all the language of our politics and a great deal of the language of our education draws indirectly and directly from the religious content. There is not a candidate for American office who does not make it clear that they are Christian. There is, I believe, one Muslim congressman, and there's the vast majority of people. And when you go up higher into political office, that becomes more and more and more obvious. In the American political spectrum, the most popular candidate is somebody who is a valid Christian, but is very mild in their practice. It makes Americans very comfortable. When you have a local population with a strong sense of identity, then you can provide yourself as more extended. So, anyway, the point is that the language of politics is also drawing upon these terminologies, these cultural touchpoints. So I talked about identity, I talked about politics. Strangely, in English, there is a word called identity politics, which is not the same thing. Identity politics is when we are competing for social identity, and you simply adopt a particular set of phrases or a particular look, and you become, a member of that group. And so, what I want to do is say that using religious terms for identity politics is both common, but it is very debased and uninteresting compared to what I was talking about before. It's a way not to talk about anything else. So, okay. Finally, we can talk about some role playing. And in the history of role playing, in the history of role playing, we have several. I'm waiting until everything stops banging and ringing and everything.
This is the first time.
Yes, I know. That's one of the downsides of this particular aspect of our culture is that it is noisy. So we have the classic situation of the fantasy adventure. And although that is not although it is not the only context for role-playing in fictional terms, it is certainly the primary one. And I include things like science fiction, pilots with their little ships. Firefly is D&D, just as much as Lord of the Rings, just as much as some other fantasy setting might be called a D&D setting. So I don't care if you're using spaceships or not. I don't care if you are playing Shadowrun or even modern day, in certain forms. But the idea of the adventuring party. In the modern day, what you have is some little specialist team. Call it food. Same thing. We have a specialist team. That's what, and all of this is a little bit divorced from the original genre. It's a little divorced from, Call of Cthulhu is not H.P. Lovecraft fiction. D&D, fantasy adventuring is not Tolkien. It's its own thing. So we've got this fantasy adventuring team as the primary context. Clearly many of the games we're playing this weekend are not like this.
Yeah.
But that is one of the primary reasons why people find them a little bit alarming, or why, conversely, a number of people find them very attractive. So, but let's look at the primary role-playing thing to do, as I've just described it. The fantasy adventuring party with whatever props or background we want to give it. And let's look at the characters who are designated as religious characters. And we find a few things. One, that almost, although if not uniquely, at least extremely, the cleric in classic Dungeons and Dragons play has always been the most faceless character of the party. And in many cases is utilized only as a bank of powers. Or as we used to say, medic. And in many ways, you gave the cleric to a person who really didn't want to do much. If you had somebody who didn't want to roleplay, but they wanted to kill a bunch of things, you gave them a fighter. And then you didn't have to worry about him. If you wanted if somebody just wants to be at the table, or you want them to be at the table, and they really don't have any imaginable reason to be there, you give them the cleric. It's a way to not roleplay.
Usually nobody wants to play that.
That's because if you get a bunch of people at the table who do want to play, they are rightly aware that this particular character brings nothing except utility. Which is another way to say that whatever the religious content is that's associated with that cleric in the classic fantasy emotional play is absent. The religious content in question is either completely just a bunch of pictures, or it is annoying because it limits behavior. And that's when, in that kind of play, fantasy adventure party play, limiting behavior through some cultural constraint is the last thing anybody wants to do. Rules that tend in that direction are routinely ignored. So, the other interesting thing then is to say, all right, let's look at religion as a feature of the setting and of the context of the adventure. So that would be the character. Now let's look at the adventure, let's look at the setting. And I don't know if you agree with me about this, I'd be interested in your feedback, but the phrase that came to me when I thought about that was, well, they are either freaks or meanies or both. The church, the religious institutions in role-playing settings are there to provide adversity because they are so bigoted and so mean and so authoritarian. And anybody else who just happens, who's supposed to be a believer of some kind, they're doing something atrocious. And they're just dogs off the leash doing something atrocious, and they wave their religious symbols a lot. And does anybody have, I can think of a few exceptions in games where religious institutional practice is not so caricatured. Bear in mind, I'm fully aware that the history of religious institutions is itself atrocious in many ways in historical terms, and also the personal activity. All this is true, but I am talking about a particularly shallow caricature as the only content for this material across most of role-playing history. Does anybody have any? I can think of one exception. Anyone else? Actually, two.
Actually, personally, this topic is so new to me. I actually never stopped thinking about such an aspect of role playing, but this last thing that you say is not actually fitting into my experience. I mean, okay, I saw people playing clerics just because, okay, you don't know what to do, stay there and heal us. That's okay. Yeah, this is very, very clear. While for the other point, no. In my personal experience, the church usually is the one who's affected by tyranny and asks for freedom, asks for revenge, which may be very keen to the experience that some people had both in Italy and in Europe, where we had massive tyranny. We suffered for we suffer from political tyranny, not for religious tyranny. So this is the image that my mind produces to me while listening to what you say. While on the other hand, probably putting religious characters in the way that you say, it's the easiest way to put religion into a fantasy contest, because you identify something like Satanism, something like clearly evil people that could be wiped out with no particular thinking.
Right.
So this is
The Cthulhu cards.
the Cthulhu cards, or also in some deities.
They are chaotic evil.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point. The point is not about. I think that it's not about religion as an aspect, particular aspect, but it's finding a mechanic that can grant you mob farming. Okay,
Right.
so you got their main targets, roll the dice, produce experience, and that's the game. It's not anything doing with behavior,
Mhm.
from my experience, obviously.
Well, yes, there's interesting things to talk about there. Many, if we were just talking about the really primary kind of play that I mentioned, it's interesting how often religion is used as a framing moral device for different groups in the game. Now, which games are you talking about in terms of the church's resisting tyranny?
Homemade adventures of any fantasy role-playing game.
The homemade adventures.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting because, and I can understand that, locally speaking. I also, so in the American context,
Sorry to interrupt, also Dragonlance, the church, that kind of church that they depicted in Dragonlance, which is missing, I mean, it's empty and the whole, because the gods are not there.
Right. Oh, boy, now there's a...
Yeah, they
Yeah,
are,
there's
but people don't see them.
Right, well, that's an interesting point right there, that there is this church that is...
The mainly clerical character, which I don't remember the name,
Right.
it's the girl that Ryston fell in love with. It's a victim of the situation.
Right.
She is a victim of both her faith, her imposed way of conduct and behaviors, and her love.
Right.
But she's the victim of all the struggling men who were.
The exceptions that I was thinking of are the fantasy setting of Glorantha, which is one of the oldest settings in role-playing, quite arguably, very demonstrably existed prior to the specific techniques of role-playing existed. It was made up prior to the specific techniques of role-playing. And in that setting, religion of all levels, from the almost private cult all the way up to a societal government, is a primary aspect of play. And transforming the world through mystical experience is really part of the point of play. It's very shamanic. The other exception that came to mind was Fading Suns, in which their science fiction version of a medieval church allowed for an immense amount of different viewpoints and political points of view within the church, and so playing a priest character or somebody in that hierarchy was very interesting. So there's a lot of room for drama and activity in there. But those are the only exceptions I know, and it's worth pointing out that in local play and in certain texts we see variations. Still, it seems to me that when we look across the vast majority of, especially textual material for the fantasy adventuring party, we see that that religion at any of those levels is a very shallow portrait for the most part. And if we are just thinking about, let's think about a more recent adventuring game of this kind. Can you think of any, I would have said Shadowrun a decade ago, and I suppose it still applies. But anything like that, more recent, that people play a lot, anything? I'm just thinking of something with a modern feel or a slight science fiction feel where you have an adventuring party.
Well, yes, Warhammer for the or the Warhammer world is highly religious and divided into gods that are demands from the followers.
Right.
But they occupy a wide variety. There are the evil gods, and there are the the good ones are.
There are any good gods?
No, actually, no, there are gods.
That's an emperor god.
Yeah, the emperor is
the
the
Right.
The emperor plays the part of material god. It's iconic for Jesus. That is bringing order to the chaos of polytheism. It's quite clear to me.
It seems to me that a lot of the European contributions are more nuanced and at least acknowledge that people in the setting will have their own personal practices. In most American role-playing and texts, the characters and many of the people in the setting just don't do anything like that. And the religious people are
just the clerics who are religious.
Right, yeah, and then these churches or other people are just dropped into the setting.
Because there are some characters who have a class feature which says which god are you a cleric of,
Right.
and the other people don't have that class feature.
Right.
Something like that.
So,
does vampire could example?
one more time?
Could vampire
Vampire
be an example of a modern setting? Or
Yeah, because there is
for
True
this world?
phase power in the world of darkness, for example.
Actually, my take is that the world of darkness is defined almost exclusively by teen or by identity politics.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so and real world identity politics. And so therefore, what the role of religion in those settings is either they are directly linked to one of these very powerful clans or groups, and is just an expression of what they can do, or they are just something that foolish mortals do. It's just some trivial aspect of life that humans do. And in general, I think that those settings are an excellent example of what I'm talking about, in terms of, instead of talking about religion as a genuine piece of identity in any of these levels, or talking about politics and policy again as mediated through different kinds of ways of looking at religion. They're just about people striving for status by belonging to particular social groups, and therefore any talk of religion in that context is basically rendered extremely true.
In my experience with the empire, the church as an institution is mainly a resource for the character.
Sure.
And this institution is like having criminal organization.
Right. So in the case of role-playing, I guess I'm saying that since the games we've been playing all through this weekend, first approach a dramatic situation a little bit differently than the original models of role-playing. So that was the first thing, was to say, how do we get play that really does produce dramatic situations whose outcomes are not known? And then the next step was to become a lot more aware of and to work with, instead of denying, gender and sexuality. So when we move into 2004, we start seeing games that are really very explicit about these issues. And I don't mean explicit in terms of graphic depiction necessarily, but explicit that these are what we are talking about. So you have in the content, you now have, it was one of the ideals of the fantasy adventuring party that it didn't matter if a character was male or female. Yeah. And that was considered to liberated and enlightened, and the way that people should look at stories and not be sexist.
To some extent it was, actually.
I'm sorry?
To some extent it was, actually.
It was.
Is the lack of difference choosing a male character or a female character. When they start telling in handbooks, okay, there is no difference. If you are a female, you can still have 18 strength.
Right.
It was.
I can see that, but the net effect, I agree with you, and I remember the very early games had gender rules that always limited the female characters.
Yes.
Those
And so-
which did not often were house rule.
Right.
It's like, it was like the first or second most common house rule
Right.
discussed in Dragon magazine
Yes,
at the
right,
time.
right. So I understand that in early role-playing there was this very definite hierarchy of male characters versus female characters. And then, what I'm saying though, was that in winning half this battle, they lost the other half. Because what they did was neuter everybody.
Yeah.
So what's the point of having an 18 instead of a 17 strength maximum when you just suddenly removed as well all gender-based content of the scenario, the setting, the situation, everything. So I don't really care about that point, in comparison to that issue. So a lot of the things we're seeing in the last 6 years in the independent design community and play community is a recovery of that, not of the change in power level, the discontinuity or the discrepancy is the word I want in power level. That's not what I mean. I'm referring to even just acknowledging that gender and sexuality in the fiction is a necessary piece of fiction for human beings. However you want to handle it, there are lots of different ways to handle it, but they're to be handled. And then second, that the same issues for the people at the table are no small issue at all. And that to pretend that there's nothing happening among us here because we're role players, well, I believe almost all of us know that elaborate soap operas can occur among members of the table and affect the fiction in a number of extremely negative ways, and affect our enjoyment of play negatively. Well, I wrote a whole book about that, so that's not that important here. But upon writing and promoting Sex and Sorcery, turned out there were a lot of people who agreed about these things, and that we have seen an explosion of games and play practices that acknowledge all of this extremely explicitly. Now you can have different rules for male and female players at the table, and nobody thinks this is abominable. The only point is whether they are fun and relevant. Now you can have different things for men and women in the fiction, and nobody thinks it's abominable. We can talk about how that is an engine for stories. So that was the first big change, was to say, if we're going to play, then we want to play about, some of us want to generate dramatic situations without having to force it. And then the second big change, I think, was this business about gender and sexuality, and again, trying to get a certain degree of honesty among us about who we are and what we are doing here was, I think, a major cultural turning point for many people. In fact, the other t-shirt with that's a picture of me on it that you've seen in this weekend is all about that. People who made that choice and said, I do want that different kind of honesty, that different kind of activity and play. It's what I've always wanted, what was I thinking? And then half of their table emphatically finds this attitude definitely threatening. It's threatening to their identity politics as geeks and role players. It's threatening to certain things happening at the table that they prefer not to acknowledge. It's threatening to the fact that the fiction we are creating will expose them as people at the table. All of those things are very threatening. And so yes, role-playing groups are exploding and imploding all over the place, and have been for years, ever since a number of us in the mid-90s finally decided that we had had enough. So the next step for me was, as you know, was to drive further into, much further into the political aspects of society and history. People who played Shahida yesterday, I don't know if Ezio is recovering yet or is going to recover. I've been aiming at a very confrontational experience, if not in the moment, at least immediately afterward, from playing in terms of politics and political history. And I'm not the only person doing that. There's a number of games doing that. But then I started thinking, that's not the whole picture. When we talk about identity, when we talk about politics, when we talk about values, we live in the world where most of the language for this has been presented in these religious terms. We get it as indoctrination or education, or both, in institutionally speaking. We get it without really knowing it from the moment we start, the moment we start interacting with any other people as children. And we get it in terms of our personal practices sooner or later. It has not yet been my responsibility. But sooner or later, I'm going to be the one who decides how a family member, how their body is handled after they are dead. I've had many of my family members die and friends die in my life, but not just from the luck of the draw and being the youngest sibling in my family. I have not yet had to make the decision of what to do with their body. I can guarantee you that that decision is going to be made in terms of the history of religious practices in my culture. And those are my choices, and the relationships among those choices, their significance to others, has all been shaped. So to say that, well, I'm not a religious person, I'm just talking about belief. What's that got to do with practice? Right? I have to make decisions at that practice level, and I am thinking in exactly the same terms as anybody else.
I think there is some common ways to try to release responsibility on something that is not perceived as himself. Okay, so they attach to personal beliefs and to the church.
Sure.
So say, okay, it's not. I'm not deciding.
Right.
Okay, this is the right way to do because they told me that this is the right way to do, and I'm doing that.
Belonging to an institution is a way to arrive at a solidity of observance, or can be a way to arrive at solidity of observance. You know, the people who are the most extreme about that are the converts. People who are converted to a religion are the ones who are going to say, okay, there's my practice. Whereas if you look at people who were raised in it, especially in generations, you discover that their observance and practice is it's variable from person to person.
Yeah.
So that I think is an excellent point to demonstrate that the two things are not really the same, but they can be taken as the same. They can be utilized as if they were the same. So so that that's an example, and there are many others. I am wearing this. I don't have to, and I'm not, as I keep repeating, I don't belong to a church, and I don't keep claiming that I don't have any of this metaphysical interest. So what in the world is this? Is it, and one could say, this is a social signal. This is a signal to the women around me that I have a particular status, and that if they do want to express any interest in me at a certain level, that there are certain rules that I have told them, you'll have to step over a line to do that. I'm stating it as realistically as I can, because we know people do break those rules. So, but the point is, this is a signal to people, you're going to be breaking the rules or we would be if we do this. So, these are all examples of the way that if we're going to try to be as honest about the human experience as we have started really to be, about gender and sexuality, about traumatic situation, about and then now about politics too, if we really are starting to take our content and our practice at the table seriously, by which I do not necessarily mean we all play like this. We're still talking about a diverting, activity. I mean, people can play, in fact, people do, I would say, almost routinely, do play great music as in musicians and enjoy themselves immensely while they do it, right? I mean, that's so I'm not making a fun, when I say serious, I don't mean the contrast it with fun. But the in the case of our position right here at this moment, it seems to me that we have certain barriers to admitting that we need to start thinking about these different levels of religion and their role in the human experience. We don't see games about this much yet. Not like we do now with Kagamatsu, or It Was a Mutual Decision, or the wide variety, or Under My Skin, or a wide variety of these other very confrontational yet very fun gender and sexuality games. Where do we see the one that is equivalent for one or another levels of religion? And yeah, again, I mean, one starts a little bit, it's a little bit of at least my personal experience of that is to say, wow, that, not only is it hard to do in terms of play and design, but culturally speaking, how in the world could I communicate about that to fellow role players without instantly encountering this very, I think, false intellectual pretense that we're modern, we're above all that, we don't have anything to do with that stuff.
It's interesting.
We're in the first
It's
season.
interesting that one game that talked about this issue is Dog of the
Yes.
I was going to say
And,
what about dogs?
I've seen a lot, really a lot of traditional players that refuse to
Right.
play the game.
Because it's got religious content.
Yes.
Right.
And carries the expectation of limiting their behavior or things like that because of their previous experience with religious content in games. Oh, these guys are religious guys, so all of them are lawful good paladins.
And yeah,
It's boring to play them.
Right.
It is a game tackling that issue, right?
Right.
Just like the games you listed for the generations.
And it illustrates precisely the problems I'm talking about. And I don't necessarily mean the game as text, but I mean the way the game is processed in our subculture illustrates the problems directly. The most common play of Dogs in the Vineyard is to play it like Call of Cthulhu. It's all about the town. And these guys come in, and they've got their powers, and they've got their role to fix the town. And then the problem usually is some thin metaphor, or thin analogy with a modern political issue. And the dogs, of course, all line up on the liberal, progressive, centrist, point of view about that issue, and then they save the town, and it's Star Trek: The Next Generation. Which is the most debased modification of the confrontational original Star Trek in political terms that I can imagine. I mean, it's sugar-free, decaffeinated, and the whole. I may have stepped on any number of fans' toes with that one, but that's okay. The thing I'm driving at is that you can play Dogs in the Vineyard, as I have been verbally trying to promote for years, and as Vincent promotes as strongly as he can in the text, and that so many players blow past and blow past and blow past in their reading, and do turn it into paladin play. And the issue that I'm almost talking about is that, I think that Vincent himself was raised in a very, very specific, very evangelical, very distinctly local American and very powerful branch of Christianity. In fact, it's so extreme in its doctrine that many Christians would be a little reluctant to call Mormons in general, or the Church of Latter-day Saints, as Christian. I mean, if not entirely dismissive, at least a little reluctant.